So this is the third of our series in Frontiers in Combustion, and if you can think of how we structured the series, right? Monday, Professor Sokolov, the big picture, energy, environment policies, assessment, and then yesterday, Dr. Jill Richards on the technological developments, new technologies, and today we focus a little bit more on biofuels, all right? And so when I think of this topic, I mean, again, the very obvious person is Professor Bill Green, who can give on this topic. But Professor Bill Green is a key member of our center. Actually, he is the initial proposer, motivator to have this center. That he could every reason he's qualified to be the director of the center, except he's very, very busy and he thinks I have some time on hand, and he talked me into being the director. So thank you very much for all the work. So, but anyway, he's my key colleague on the center, and he himself, so many his experience in the fundamentals of combustion, but practical aspect of the fuels. And also the industrial needs, because he has spent time in industry before he went to MIT, and now he is the Harvard professor. It's the most prestigious position there in terms of combustion at MIT. So he's just a trove of knowledge, knows everything. And when I don't know things, I call him up and ask him. So. Let me see, and also in our center, we have three thrusts, as I told you, with the foundation fuels, thrust in terms of developing mechanism. The foundation fuels, the alcohols, and the biodiesel, and Professor Green is in charge of the biofuels thrust. So without further ado, I think I'll just give you Dr. Green.
So thank you for coming. I'm going to give a pretty long talk, and I know it's after lunch, so I hope you guys will stay engaged. And to help you stay engaged, I want you to know there is a quiz, and the quiz questions will come through the talk. So if you have your pencil and paper ready, when we get to the questions, be ready to write them down. So we have a 5-part talk. First, I'm going to start out and give the big picture and the big issues. Might be related a little bit to what Professor Sokolov talked about on Monday. Then I would talk about alternatives to petroleum. Again, relatively big picture. Then what do you want in a new fuel? So I'm going to assume that after we discuss petroleum, you might decide that petroleum is not the best. And so we might want to have something different. And so let's talk about what we would need. And also, suppose we wanted to sell some new fuel at a gas station besides gasoline and diesel. What would that be? So we'll talk about that. And then in the end, I'll talk about biofuels, which are considered by many people to be the most promising alternative fuel. And again, there will be a quiz. All right, so the big picture. First thing to keep in mind is that people really need transportation. People really want transportation. The economy depends on transportation. And we like to have cars, so we can travel around. We need trucks. The modern economy is very heavily reliant on truck transportation. People like to fly around on airplanes, like I flew one last night to come down to this conference from MIT. I don't know if we really need them, but pretty nice. And because people want this so much, they want transportation, it makes the demand for fuel what's called inelastic. That means that once that people have invested to buy a vehicle, basically they're going to pay to buy the fuel to be able to use that vehicle. And unless the fuel price gets to be extremely high, you won't see much change in the demand. And this is a very important economic thing. And I guess I should emphasize from the beginning, I'm a scientist. I was trained as a physical chemist. But what I've learned is that in energy, you have to think about economics almost from the beginning. If you don't think about the economic realities, you're not talking about reality for energy problems. Second big point is that liquid fuels are the best fuels. And the key point is the liquids flow. Okay? And that makes them a lot better than solids. So in the old days, the technology was based on coal. and all the ships that went around the ocean had hundreds of guys in the bottom of the ship who had shovels, who were shoveling coal into the boiler. And there was universal agreement that that was a stupid idea. And as soon as they invented liquid fuels, everybody got rid of all the coal fuels. So there used to be steam trains that had guys shoveling coal in. There used to be boilers in every basement of every skyscraper in Manhattan with a guy shoveling coal in there. And basically the whole society decided that was an idiotic idea. Liquid fuels are way better. So they're really a lot better than solids. And liquid fuels have very high volumetric and mass energy density, and that gives them a big advantage over gases. So gases aren't that bad because they flow too. But the problem is you need an awful big storage container, or you have to handle them with very high pressure, which makes a lot of trouble. And another problem with gases is they tend to leak. Liquids are very nice. You get a bucket, you pour a liquid in, you don't need to close the bucket up. The liquid will still be there tomorrow. Gases, unless you're really careful in your distribution system, you're likely to have a lot of leaks and lose a lot of material through gas. And liquids are very easy and convenient. So all over the world, you can go to the furthest, most remote village in the Andes, and you'll still find people have liquid fuels that somehow got there. People were able to distribute it and get the liquid fuels wherever they are. And because liquid fuels are so great, a humongous volume of liquid fuels are being used. So currently the world uses, the humans in the world are burning about 80 million barrels per day of liquid fuels. It's just a tremendous scale. And a key thing to keep in mind throughout this whole discussion is the problem of scale. That if you want to materially change the system we're in, you have to have a humongous solution because we have a humongous problem. And little tiny niche solutions can be interesting, they might make you some money, but they're not going to really materially affect the societal situation. Now, liquid fuels are really great, and that's why everybody wants to have them. And probably you yourself personally have spent some money to buy liquid fuels, I would guess. But they're pretty expensive. So it costs between 3 and 10 times more dollars per joule to buy a liquid fuel than it does to buy a gaseous fuel or a solid fuel. And because of this big price differential, order of magnitude price differential, it turns out that liquid fuels are where all the money is. So in the energy field, there's plenty of, we get a lot of electricity from burning coal. We use lots of natural gas in this country. And those are burned in very large volumes too, about the same volume as petroleum. But the money associated with them is way smaller. It's not even in the same order of magnitude as the money associated with liquid fuels. So liquid fuels, the fuel itself is very expensive. And then the vehicles that we use that burn the fuel are also very expensive, in fact, usually more. So the capital investment in the liquid fuels is very, very large, even larger than the very large amount of money we spend on the fuel. And the order of magnitude is trillions of dollars per year, money being sent across borders to buy liquid fuels from different countries. So that's a very large amount of dollars. And so in the USA, it's about $2,000 per year per person is spent to buy liquid fuels. So it's about something like 5% of the total income of the United States. Now, 5% is not enough to totally change the economy, but if you think about it, $2,000 is a lot. If you consider that a lot of countries in the world, people have incomes of maybe $500 a year. So each of us is spending 4 times as much as the whole complete income of many people in many countries in the world. So this is a very significant amount of money. And this is a really serious problem because the people in the poor countries would certainly like to have transportation just as much as we like to have transportation here. And so as their incomes rise, you can bet that they're going to spend a lot of that income to buy vehicles and to buy liquid fuels to run those vehicles. Another huge issue about liquid fuels is energy security. So it turns out that a lot of the oil in the world is located very far from where people live. And because of that, it has to be transported great distances from where it's produced to where people use it. That's caused a lot of trouble. So in the 70s, for example, there was a big embargo. It caused a huge disruption in the world economy. Earlier in the 20th century, there were blockades at both World War I and World War II. And by a lot of measures, those blockades were actually the reason why the Allies were victorious in those wars, because they were able to blockade the energy. And in fact, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because the government of Japan was afraid that the other countries would impose an oil blockade. And they thought we better go quick and grab the Dutch East Indies present-day Indonesia, in order to have access to the oil. And so oil sort of precipitated the war. Concerns about oil precipitated that war, and also led to the conclusion of those wars were highly determined by blockades. Now, you can be sure that all of the people who are at military summer school, not doing combustion summer school, but at military summer school, are all very aware of the history of the blockades. And is very much on the mind of the military leaders all around the world to make sure that their country doesn't get blockaded, to make sure that if they want to win in a war that they can blockade the enemy, whoever they think might be an enemy. And so this issue is with us, and energy security is a very realistic issue. And some people would claim that the reason why the United States got so heavily involved in the Persian Gulf Wars and the Iraq War, and is currently involved so much with Iran, is very heavily related to concerns about blockades and security of supply. And the United States apparently is willing to spend many billions of dollars to ensure its security of supply. All right, so it's a lot of money. It's a very big security defense concern. It's also a very big environmental problem. So about 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions are from burning transportation fuels, primarily from burning oil. And these are also a major contributor to urban air pollution. And in many cities around the world, the air pollution is a very major contributor to health problems. And there's very strong links between mortality rates and particulates caused primarily from air pollution, either from burning coal or from transportation from vehicles. In the United States, cities like Los Angeles still don't satisfy the health regulations on ozone, even after many years and a lot of investments in trying to clean up the transportation infrastructure there to try to reduce the emissions. And they've reduced the emissions a lot, but the base level of Los Angeles, when I was a graduate student, I went to the American Chemical Society meeting there in Los Angeles in the 80s, and the air was so bad that I basically couldn't go outside. I was just getting sick right away, and you couldn't see at the end of the block because of the ozone haze caused by the smog. Tim Wallington at Ford, he gave a talk last week at the Kinetics conference, and he had photographs he had taken during the 80s when he lived in Los Angeles, and verified this. I mean, I wouldn't be able to see the guy in the back row over there because the air quality was so poor because of all the smog. So that's a very serious problem. If you go today to cities like Mexico City, you'll see it's very much the same there now, and hopefully they'll get better technology and improve like Los Angeles has improved, but it's still a very serious problem. I've heard in China, something like $1 trillion a year of lost productivity in China because of health problems caused by air pollution, primarily from burning fuels. All right, so it's a huge environmental and health problem. It's a huge military security problem. It's a huge money problem. And it's what people want. They want to be able to have transportation. And so because of all these things, government is very heavily involved. It's very important. So therefore, the government's involved. And because of this, you have to consider political issues as well as all the other issues when you try to think about energy problems. And also, you have to think about behavioral problems because everybody's involved. Almost everybody in the economy is buying liquid fuels and doing something with them. And if you want to change what happens with liquid fuels, you have to consider how all these people are going to feel, what are they going to want to do, what are their actions going to be. And that makes the problem sort of a sociological problem as well. And of course, most of you here are engineers and scientists, and this is a huge technological problem. And we'll talk about that. But just don't forget, it's also the economic issues are very important. Now, I talked about how we like liquid fuels because they have high energy density. And they have high energy density compared to gases. So for example, here's the liquid fuels over here, and the hydrogen is in here. It's sort of maybe a factor of 5 or 10 lower density than the liquid fuels. Another potential way to do transportation is to use batteries. And so for example, you can buy the Nissan Leaf and the Tesla, I forget what it's called, very nice little roadster they have. They're just battery vehicles. But the battery energy density is more than an order of magnitude down from liquid fuel density. So this is a log plot. And so that causes a lot of trouble. So for example, the Tesla, the whole body of the car has to be built around where they control the batteries. So it really constrains the design. And they're very clever and they're able to do it, but they still end up with a car that only holds 2 people. probably has many times the weight of batteries compared to the weight of the people it's carrying. So this is a very important issue, is the energy density. An interesting thing about this topic, and very timely right now, is that the world energy market is changing dramatically. So this is the billion barrels a year produced of oil and the different parts of the world it was produced in over time from 1930 up to projections out to 2050. And at the time this chart was made, which I think was 2004, this was the projection that the Army Corps of Engineers, I don't know, whoever ASPO is, I don't know who this is. Anyway, they made a projection. They just drew a tangent line to the slope at the moment when they did it and said, well, the demand is going to look like that. Let's just keep going up. And the production, from what they could see from the geology, was going to go down. And so therefore we had a gap of pretty substantial number of billions of gallons of gasoline, billions of barrels. And the IEA made a similar projection in 2002, and they projected that the production would more or less keep up with the demand because they projected that the Middle East would invest a lot in increasing its productive capacity. My general comment about this is that what you can see is that the demand projections really outrace the supply. But I would just caution that both these are very uncertain. But it's alarming if you think about it. If you think that there's currently about 1 billion people have cars, and you might think that 50 years from now, 7 billion people will have cars, 8 billion people will have cars. And so they're going to need a lot of fuel. And so where's all that fuel going to come from? And the geologists are telling us basically when they look for conventional oil, they don't see it. They don't see that there's going to be that much oil available. So something's going to happen. But the projections have historically not been that great. And the problem is that people always draw these straight extrapolation lines, assume everything's going to keep on going the way it is today. But historically, that never happens. Things don't last. We have our mindset is we think everything stays the same, but actually things change wildly. And because of that, all these kind of smooth projections, first of all, I should just say they're completely nonsensical right from the beginning. And historically, if you look back, there's been wars, there's been economic crises, and natural disasters. All kinds of things have caused the projections to be incorrect. There have been political changes, both positive and negative, that have drastically affected demand. And for example, the biggest recent one is China. China's economic development due to political changes in China was really dramatic and really changed the whole world energy market. Technology changes have very huge effects. Now you can consider the projections before and after Ford invented the Model T. It's totally night and day. And before that, only very, very rich people had cars. Total fuel demand was probably like 1,000 barrels a year or something. And then all of a sudden it changed, and now we're using 80 million barrels every single day. Another thing to keep in mind is that because the fuel demand is not elastic, the prices can fluctuate really wildly, even for relatively small imbalances between supply and demand. And when the prices are high, that inspires increased production. And so it's likely if the prices got really high that the Middle East production would actually increase a lot. Also, if the prices are high enough, people invest more in alternatives, and that also does it. But all these kinds of investments have lag times, order of magnitude of about 5 years between the time that they make the investment decision before the new production is available. And so during those 5 years, the prices can spike really, really high. And then after the new production comes online, very often the prices collapse because now there's more production than the demand warrants. And also what can happen, has happened recently, is the high prices can drive the world economy into recession. So if the price gets high enough, then people who need to be able to use transportation to keep the economy going can't do it. And so then the economy slows down, and then the whole thing can collapse very fast. And so you'll see wild price fluctuations when the supply and demand get out of balance. And here's a plot of that. So this is the price versus year from 1947 to 2006 is on the plot. And then I freehanded in this gold line with what the prices have done since then. And you can see the prices are pretty wild. They fluctuate all over the place, and nobody can predict this. And there's a lot of speculators in Wall Street who spend a lot of time trying to predict this, but I would say Mostly they don't do that well. You can see different events that sometimes precipitated spikes in price and sometimes collapses in price to different recessions. Now this fuel price fluctuation, you might say, well, I'm an engineer, why do I care about this? And the reason you should care about this is that, first of all, maybe it means you won't have a job. So the price spikes too high, the world economy can go into recession, and then you may not be able to get hired when you finish up wherever you are. The second thing is that all the alternative fuel projects are based on some estimate of what the future price is going to be when the project is completed. And if that estimate is too far off, the project can go bankrupt immediately. And this has happened many times. And people have started big projects, and then the prices collapsed, and they'll be 2 or 3 years into building the project, and they'll realize that they're going to lose money, and the bankers will call the loans, and the whole thing collapses, and they go into foreclosure. There's, I think, still some towns out in Utah that Unocal built during the 70s, 80s price hike during the energy shortage then, that no one ever lived in. They built whole towns. They have the houses and the roads and sewers and everything, and they were going to build a big giant shale oil project, and it just never happened. And then with Unocal, I don't know if they even exist anymore. I think they got bought out by somebody else because they lost their shirt on building a city in Utah that was not necessary economically. This is a very big problem. The price fluctuation is often larger than all the technological uncertainties. And so it becomes the biggest risk from the point of view of the investor, is trying to guess what future prices are going to be. And also it's possible that, for example, OPEC might intentionally just drop the price to kill off competition. Now, I don't know if this actually happens, but certainly the investors are afraid this can happen. And because of all this risk, the investors demand a very high rate of return on the risk. And so what it means is that if you propose some new alternative fuel project, unless you can promise that you can hand them money hand over fist the first year you build the project, most investors are going to say, forget it. I'm not interested in making the investment because it's too much risk. I can just buy, real estate in Manhattan or something, and it's a lot more secure than investing in some alternative fuel project somewhere. All right, so why or why not use fossil fuels? So what do we got? We have a very large amount of fossil fuels, but it's finite. And we're definitely going to run out of fossil fuel energy, but probably it might be a century or 2 centuries before we run out. So that's maybe the long-term issue. What's really good about fossil fuels is we have a humongous amount of them right now, and we know how to produce them in very high quantities right now. And that's very different than the other energy sources that we have. And also, although the price is high, for example, for oil, the actual cost of production is low. So, for example, when Saudi Arabia wants to sell some oil, they can produce it for maybe $10 a barrel, and then they can sell it for $85 a barrel, and so they're making a nice profit. But that production cost is low, so if they need to lower the price, they still run a business. They'll keep on selling the oil. They're not going to go out of business because the production price is very low. The medium-term issue has to do with the greenhouse gas effect. So because of the greenhouse gas emissions, the climate's changing. And if we keep on the path we're on now, it's going to change a lot. And it looks like we're likely to run out of atmosphere to hold the CO2 before we run out of carbon that's in the ground to burn. So we really, our more pressing issue is to try to deal with the greenhouse gas problem. And we could try things like trying to capture CO2 and burying it underground, things like that. But it's possible we might even fill the capacity to do that. So I think that it's not at all clear that we know how to handle the CO2 problem if we continue the path we are. So at the moment, the oil is expensive. We're probably running out of it. It's definitely not secure, and it's a greenhouse gas problem. So let's think of what else we could do besides using oil. All right, so here I'm going to go through 8 different options. The first option is we can just improve efficiency. So we can keep on burning oil, but just not burn as much of it. And if you look into a lot of vehicle technologies, in many of them you can see that there's probably a factor or 2 to be gained by improvements in the engines and the way we run the system. And this is a really interesting topic. And I think if you, for example, go to Professor Wright's talks in the morning, we can tell you about some of the new inventions that they have in internal combustion engines. There's also been a lot of innovations in jet engines. So I think there's really good prospects that the we can improve efficiency a lot. But this talk is mostly about alternative fuels, so I'm not going to talk anything about all these great efficiency improvements. But just remember that this is really option number one. This is a really good option. And we also have to remember you have the size of the vehicle, the power of the vehicle, the speed of the vehicle. Usually these things trade off versus the energy efficiency. So it's really a trade-off. If you're going to want to have a more efficient vehicle, usually you have to sacrifice something. Usually you have to pay more because more efficient engines cost more than less efficient engines. And also, you often have to sacrifice something else. And just the thing I want you to remember is the vehicle cost is usually more than the fuel cost. So that really economically limits what you can do with efficiency. Because the customer is not going to get the money back. If the fuel cost is low enough, it's cheaper for them to just use a lousy vehicle and just burn a lot of gas if the vehicle is cheap enough. So it's very challenging for people like Rolls-Royce who are inventing new engines. They have to figure out engines that are more efficient but basically no more expensive or not much more expensive than the engines we have now. So that the economic equation is really in the favor of the efficiency. Now, a way to think about this that McKinsey thought of, which I think is really nice, is plots like this, where they can plot the cost of an energy and efficiency improvement versus the scale of how much energy you would save. And so here they did it for a lot of different components of the economy, and you could do the same thing for transportation. And you can think of all the different things you can do and how much energy you would save by each different thing and how much it would cost to implement. So for example, in engines, one thing you could do is switch from gasoline engines to diesel engines. It costs a little bit of money. You get some certain amount of fuel economy benefit. Then maybe you could go and use some more advanced technology engine, HECI or dual fuel or something like that, and get a little bit further. And then maybe you could go to hybrids and use some batteries along with some fuel and get a little bit further, and so on. And you can actually price out what the cost is for each of those improvements in efficiency and how much energy you save. And that way it gives you kind of a way to make an economic trade-off. And you can make a plot like this and see what would be the sensible innovations to do next. All right, so now it's time for a quiz. All right, so diesel engines are more efficient than the spark-ignited engines, but they're also a little bit more expensive to manufacture. So why does it make sense for Europeans to use diesel cars, but not for Americans? So you guys should write down this quiz question number one. Take a few minutes. So yeah, I think I have the answer. What's the answer?
The gas price in Europe is high.
That's right. So this is a question about the trade-off between capital investment and fuel cost. So in Europe, there's a very high tax on transportation fuels, and because of that, the cost to the consumer is very high for fuel. So it shifts the balance. So the trade-off economically makes sense for a consumer to switch to diesels in Europe. You pay a little bit more money up front because you're going to save more money in the fuel economy. In the US, you get the same fuel economy, but the fuel's so much cheaper that you would hardly notice it economically. So that's why in the United States, the spark ignition engines have had an advantage over diesels with the current pricing. Now, of course, if there were a carbon tax or if the price of fuel were to go up in the United States, then it might well reach the same situation as in Europe. All right, second option. We can forget fuels altogether and just go to batteries. And so this is commercial. You can buy cars like this right now. It's not going to work for airplanes, not anytime soon, I don't think. When you do it in cars, because of the low energy density, you get a reduced range compared to liquid fuels. And maybe more importantly, you get a slow recharge rate. So that's an inconvenience to the customer, that if they run out of batteries, they might have to wait a while before they can drive. Another issue is expense. So batteries are a capital expense. You have to buy a very expensive battery pack at the beginning. And with the present technology and cost structure, the United States subsidizes battery cars by about $8,000 per car, and they still haven't taken over the market, which means I think that the cost of batteries is probably $9,000 per car or something like that. So the subsidy's not quite enough to drive everybody to buy battery cars. And the recharging infrastructure is not really there yet in the United States, so you have to, if you buy a battery car, you really have to look up and find out where are the fast recharge stations near you and memorize that list, because they're not at every corner like the gasoline stations are. Now, of course, using batteries would be great for energy security, so it solves one of our problems. because basically every developed country has electricity. And so it removes the need to import oil to run the transportation. But you have to think of where the electricity is coming from. So in many countries, the electricity primarily comes from coal, including this country. And if you burn coal to make the electricity to run your battery vehicles, then actually the net emissions, the net greenhouse gas emissions are slightly worse than it would be if you burned oil. You get more efficiency in the vehicle because the battery vehicles, electric motors are more efficient than internal combustion engines. But you lose in the fact that in the coal power plant, those plants aren't that efficient. And also coal is a more carbon-intensive fuel source. So this is actually negative for the environment to switch to batteries if you're running from coal. On the other hand, if you're using other sources of electricity, then this might actually be net beneficial to the environment. And so this is kind of a close call, and you could look up about each technology and do a life cycle analysis to figure out. Now, a lot of people I've read would say, well, let's just use wind and solar to make the electricity for the batteries. And that's definitely a possibility. But I just would point out that wind and solar are more expensive than, for example, coal. And so that's why we get our electricity from coal right now. And it'd be quite a significant capital investment to try to replace the whole electricity infrastructure with renewables. And then if we actually were to do that, when the penetration of the wind and solar into the market got big enough, we'd have a big storage problem because the wind and the solar, certain hours of the day, they make a lot more electricity than they do at other hours. And so you'd have to figure out some way to store that energy to balance out the load. But I think actually more likely we're stuck at the beginning of just the economic problem that the wind and the solar. Right now, for example, there's a lot of wind being constructed in the United States, but only when the Congress puts a big subsidy on it. And when they turn the subsidy off, all the wind projects stop. So it's like almost 100% driven by the subsidy. So that's probably not economically sustainable for building your entire utility infrastructure that way. All right, option number 3, compressed natural gas. Now this is a technology that's already commercial. So for example, when I took the bus to Logan Airport, I'm riding on a compressed natural gas bus. There's serious interest right now in the United States in converting a lot of long-haul trucking to compressed natural gas. You get a reduced range, also similar to batteries, because the gas has a lower energy density than the fuels. So you can't, I don't think you could use compressed natural gas as the reasonable fuel for airplanes, but it works okay for trucks and even for cars. It's not quite as good as gasoline, but not terrible. If we were to switch to compressed natural gas to run our transportation structure, then we would need a new distribution system, because you want to have high pressure gas available at every corner so you can go fill your car. And right now we have gas available almost everywhere, but it's not high enough pressure to be a fast recharge for your vehicle. And not to pump it up to the pressure you want, in order to have a good range in your vehicle, you want to use very high pressure natural gas in the cylinders. I think it's an interesting question, which I don't know the answer to, is whether or not it's economical. So right now, gas prices are historically low in the United States, very inexpensive to buy natural gas, but it's a pretty big capital investment in putting in the infrastructure in and putting in the tanks and so on. And so I don't know overall if it would actually economically be a good idea or not to switch. Maybe overall it's a little bit cheaper than relying on oil, but I'm not sure. In some countries, I think with the local fuel prices, which have to do with local taxation, it is cheaper. And so some countries have pretty significant conversions to compressed natural gas. So Pakistan, for example, Brazil, those are countries where you can actually go to your corner mechanic and they'll stick a gas tank in your back and do a few little tweaks in your fuel injection system and tell you can run natural gas now. Now, although right now the natural gas supply in the United States is very plentiful, this is an unusual situation. And just a few years ago, we actually had a big shortage of natural gas in the United States. And if you look longer term, if you were to switch the transportation infrastructure over to natural gas, we don't really have enough production to do that. So probably people would have to import liquefied natural gas, and most likely from Russia or from the Persian Gulf. And so then you wonder, well, maybe this is really no more secure than oil to begin. So for energy security, I'm not so sure. And then there's a policy issue here, that right now the policy of the government is basically to favor natural gas over coal to make electricity. And so what's happening is that no one's building any new coal plants, and when they build a new plant, they build a natural gas plant, and then the coal plants get old enough or have trouble, they shut them down. And I think that's the policy of the government. I've never heard it explicitly stated, but I believe from their actions that's what the policy of the government is. Now, if they were going to redirect all that natural gas to be used for transportation, then I don't know if there'd be enough natural gas to also supply all the electricity that they want to replace. So there's a decision here. Do we want to use natural gas for electricity, or do we want to use it for transportation? And I would say that, at least in the United States, it's unlikely that that decision would be made purely economically. It probably is going to have a lot to do with what the government wants the utilities to do, for example, with natural gas, and also whether the government were to subsidize putting in the infrastructure to do refueling or not. And I'd say right now the jury is completely out on that. But you could do it. So for example, certainly we have enough coal. You could use coal to make electricity and switch all the gas over. If you were most concerned about balance of payments or something, that might be a good idea. Another possibility is maybe you build a whole lot more nuclear power plants to make the electricity and use the natural gas for transportation. That would be possible too. So it's a possibility. We have the technology. We can rebuild them. We could switch our whole system over to natural gas. There's a natural gas bus. And it's probably a benefit to the environment to do that. Though there's some recent dispute about this because depending on exactly what the leak rate is from your gas infrastructure, the methane is also a very powerful greenhouse gas. At the moment in the United States, it's cost effective to use natural gas for buses and for trucks. They use a lot of fuel, but it would require a significant investment in fueling stations if you wanted all the cars to use it, for example. Natural gas is pretty expensive and hard to get in EU, China, Japan. So maybe it's better to not use natural gas for transportation, but to use it for these other things. So I'd say basically compressed natural gas is an option. It could work, but liquid fuel definitely has some advantages over it. So I don't know if it really makes sense. Option number 4. It's making oil out of tar. So in Alberta and Venezuela, for example, there are very huge deposits of tar in the ground. And you can produce this oil something about $50 a barrel to take the tar, get it out of the ground, convert it into some kind of liquid that's shippable, say in a pipeline. But this production and conversion requires a lot of energy because tar is much more difficult to handle than conventional oil. Conventional oil, you dig a pipe in the ground. It's like a soda straw. And you dig it in there. Usually the oil's under pressure. It just squirts out. It's about as easy as you can do. Later, you might have to pump it a little bit, but it doesn't take much energy to get the oil out. If you have tar, especially, for example, in Alberta, Canada, tar, it's not just tar, it's frozen tar. It's completely frozen in the permafrost. It's solid chunks of stuff that you would use like as paving material to pave your road. And now you want to convert that into a liquid you're going to put inside your car. So it's a little bit difficult to get it out of the ground and melt it and convert it and use it. And at the moment, what's done is they take a lot of natural gas and they use that to heat up, to melt the tar. And then they also use the natural gas to make hydrogen, or to use to partially hydrogenate the tar, hydrocrack it, so that they can make it a liquid. You've probably heard commercials. I don't know if they have them down here. Game over for the climate. Have you heard this? No one. In Massachusetts, anyway, they have game over for the climate. Maybe the rest of the country doesn't care. This is one of the political opponents of the Keystone XL pipeline, which you might have heard about a few weeks ago. Anyway, that was the commercials they were running opposed to building that pipeline. And the issue here is that the tar is another relatively high carbon source of fossil fuel that's in very huge quantities, similar to coal. And so if you were to decide that we're going to run our society off this energy source for the next 100 years, there's probably enough tar there you can do it. Then you think of how much carbon you would burn, how much CO2 you would emit. It turns out to be a lot. And so then you might think, well, 100 years from now, we might really regret it because the whole climate may have changed pretty badly from the way it is now. right now, in Alberta tar sands, they make a couple million barrels per day of oil out of the tar. And there's a lot of big local environmental impacts in Alberta. So here's a picture of one of the pits where they dig out the tar. And this truck, you see the staircase here? That's the staircase that the guy has to climb up in order to get into the truck to drive it. So this truck is considerably larger than my house. This is the biggest earth-moving operation in the world. Each of these trucks costs $5 million. They have to dig out 5 tons of sand and peat and produce a barrel of wastewater per every barrel of oil they make in this process. And so they're making 2 million barrels per day, so that's a lot of polluted oil they're making, 2 million barrels per day of polluted oil, of polluted water. So here's an aerial photograph of one of the areas there. And so all this stuff here is all sort of the wasteland caused by the tar production. Here's the Athabasca River, which provides the water they need to do this process. They've invented a technology a little bit better for getting the tar out, where they inject steam. They burn a lot of natural gas to make hot steam. They pump the steam under the ground for a long time, like for a year. And you put enough steam in there for a whole year, you actually can melt below the permafrost, melt all that frozen tar, and it actually turns into a hot liquid. And they put another pipe down below with holes in it, and the liquid seeps down here and gets sucked out through the other pipe. And so this is actually a pretty nice way to produce the tar. It's a lot less messy than what I just showed you. But it requires a very huge amount of natural gas, because you're basically cooking the entire Earth. You know, like cubic kilometers of frozen Earth you're trying to melt and get up above the melting point of tar so you can get it to flow easily. And so there's a scale, it's like kilometers kind of scale with these pipes. All right. So I've done 4 options. Here's the 5th option, is to make biofuel out of food. And this is how we do it in the United States. So we take corn, which we would normally use to make cornbread or feed pigs. And instead we take the cornstarch and we make it into ethanol, which we then use in our gasoline. And the equation here is basically we take some natural gas, some really nice farmland in Iowa, some subsidy from the government, and we use that to make a liquid fuel. And actually the subsidy I think is actually shrinking a lot. Maybe somebody from farm states can tell me better, but I believe it's shrunk a lot, so maybe I shouldn't emphasize that too much. And this works because the natural gas prices are very low, and the price of liquid fuel is very high. So the economics work, even though the equation, if you look at it, doesn't look like it's such a smart idea. And currently, this is reducing our oil imports by something like 5%. Now, I looked at this program. I think of it, this is really primarily a farm subsidy program. So in the past, there was a lot of surplus production in the United States, agriculture. They used to pay farmers not to plant fields. And so instead of paying them not to plant the field, they said, well, plant the field with corn, make it into ethanol. We'll use it to reduce our balance payments problem for oil a little bit. And that's really what this is about. In the UU, they also have a farm subsidy program like this. They make biodiesel out of canola, there's rapeseeds. And they take lots and lots of farmland and a subsidy, and they make a little tiny bit of fuel, because rapeseeds is not a very efficient way to make fuel. This is definitely a farm subsidy program in the EU. And the basic problem is there's just not enough farmland to make enough food that we can significantly replace the fuel demand. So the fuel demand is so huge that even if you redirected all the food to make fuel, you wouldn't make enough fuel. So this is not really a sustainable thing. And if you try to push this, you can definitely push up food prices. And we had some examples. I think in 2007, some countries had food riots because there was a food shortage. And it was definitely, I don't know if it was caused by, it was definitely exacerbated by the fact that a lot of farmland was being directed to make energy crops instead of making food. Option number 6. Okay, so this is similar to the compressed natural gas. We can take natural gas, but instead of keeping it compressed, you can chemically convert it to make it into a liquid. And so the way this usually works is you take the natural gas, which is mostly methane, you take a little bit of oxygen from the air, and you partially burn the methane to make CO and hydrogen. It's called syngas. Then you react the syngas over a catalyst, and you can make some alkanes and steam. And what's happening is you're basically partially burning the methane, so you're making a lot of steam. And so the energy associated with that is basically being wasted. So you had chemical energy in your methane, but now some of it's been lost because you used it to make steam. At the present, the economics are not that great for this, and so it's not really been widely applied. However, the biggest project in the world was just started up this last year. I'll show you that. Now, this whole idea is really not that good for security, because the places you would do it is places where there's a huge amount of natural gas, which is basically the Persian Gulf, maybe Russia. And it's not very good for the greenhouse because you're basically using a lot of energy to make a relatively small amount of energy. And so net, this is not an efficient use of fossil fuels. It's pretty expensive. But what it really is good for is supply, because there's a lot of natural gas. And so if you can convert the natural gas to liquids, you actually make a lot more liquids and drive the price of liquids down and supply more liquid fuel. There's other ways you might try to do this, to convert methane into liquids. So there's a method where people make methanol instead of alkanes. That's pretty easy. It's done pretty widely. There's a bunch of other concepts and patents, but I would say most of them have not been successful commercially. But there's a lot of different ideas the chemists have about how to do this. The general problem with this, of course, is that the methane is much less reactive than the products, almost every product you could make. So that's why you actually running it all the way to CO here, is that all the way from methane down to CO, there's almost nothing you can trap. You basically have to run it to CO to get the reaction to stop. And you really would like to trap it back at, say, methanol, for example, but that's just not practical. So even to make methanol, what they usually do is they run it to CO and they run it backwards a little bit to make some methanol. And then there's some biological ways to do this, and it's possible they might be competitive with chemistry, but it's, again, not commercial, so I don't know. This is the picture of the world's largest gas-to-liquids facility in Qatar. It's built by Shell, just opened last year. Reportedly, they spent $24 billion. I don't know if this number's exactly right. And they definitely are making 240,000 barrels a day. So I calculated down, if I did this division right, that's $100,000 investment for every barrel per day of capacity, which sounded like an incredible amount to me. But if you multiply it out, if you can sell your oil for $100 per barrel, you make $100 per day for every barrel, and so $36,000 per year for each barrel capacity, and that all works out to be a 3-year payback. So, and according to reports, that the gas they got was basically free or very inexpensive from Qatar. So, maybe this is actually economical, even though it just seems outrageous. You spend so much money. I think that this project was so big it actually significantly affected the world's steel price when they were building this. That the steel prices went up in the world because they built this. Is, a huge part of the $24 billion was just buying steel. So it's a very big project. It's now 1/12 of all of Shell's production of liquids is one facility. All right, time for a quiz. Quiz question number 2. So Shell is invested, as you saw, in this huge gas-to-liquids facility to make liquid diesel fuel from natural gas. But the US truck companies are investing to develop trucks that burn compressed natural gas. Can they both be right? Can it be right to be making trucks that burn compressed natural gas at the same time you're taking natural gas to make it liquid fuel?
Yes.
How many of you say yes? How many of you say no? How many of you have no idea? All right. Okay, somebody from the no camp. You have a no? Do you have any explanation? Yes. Why not?
You're going in 2 different directions.
They're definitely going in 2 different directions, that's for sure.
So
Yeah.
I guess your development is not exactly right.
All right, so from simple economics, you would think it can't be right to both compress natural gas and sell it that way, and also take your natural gas and sell it as a liquid. One of those guys is going to make more money than the other, right? That's what would be your first thought, right? Transport. Transport is key. So is natural gas easy to transport?
No.
No, it's almost impossible to transport, right? So that's the key here, is that the US truck companies are working on compressed natural gas for the US market only, where the natural gas price is low. From the point of view of Qatar, even if they compress the natural gas, they can't ship it. So it does no good. But if they make it a liquid, they can sell it. And in fact, they can sell it anywhere in the world, wherever the diesel price is the highest, they can sell it. So it actually makes sense for both for both of them at the same time, even though it seems totally bizarre. And this kind of thing happens a lot with natural gas because it's not shippable, even inside countries. So for example, we have a lot of shale gas being produced in the United States right now. It turns out that China has a much larger reserve of shale gas than the United States does, but they're not producing it. So why is that? It's because the shale gas in China is in Western China. It's so far away from where the people live that the cost of the pipeline makes it economically not practical. So it's cheaper for them actually to buy the liquefied natural gas from Qatar, shipped all the way around, halfway around the world from the Middle East, than it would be for them to build a gigantic pipeline from Western China to get you to use their own shale gas. So economics of natural gas are really local because it's not shippable. Whereas for the liquid fuels, they're very easy to ship, so basically the prices are almost the same everywhere. All right. And of course, if you can get a cheap fuel, some location, then it might make sense to make a vehicle that can use that cheap fuel. And so that's what's going on in the United States right now for the trucks. All right. Option number 7. We can make liquids out of coal. This is very similar chemistry to the gas to liquids problem. So you take coal and steam and oxygen, and you react them. You can make CO, CO2, and H2. This is called gasification. It turns out you don't make enough hydrogen this way because coal doesn't have that much hydrogen in it. So you have to shift some of the CO you make to hydrogen by this water gas shift reaction. It makes a little bit more CO2. Then once you have the right ratio of CO to hydrogen, you can react them to make alkanes, make some more steam. So that's similar to what I showed you before. Or you can make methanol. And this technology is very well established. I believe it was developed in World War I by the Germans. And it's been practiced for a long time in South Africa. And now it's practiced in China, at least as one to make the methanol. This is very good for energy security because by a weird coincidence, coal is mostly located where a lot of people live, in populous countries. I don't know why. And so there's not really much of an energy security issue about coal. The economics are pretty marginal. So for example, in South Africa, they had the plants. They've actually shut them down. So that's very strange. It means you have shut down economics. It's cheaper to do some alternative than to just keep running a plant you already made the capital investment in. So it means it's a very expensive process. And the CO2 emissions are really pretty bad because you're emitting CO2. All these CO2s here are going to be emitted. And also, this is not a very efficient use of coal because you also release a lot of steam. So this is really not a very energy efficient process. But maybe you could capture the CO2 and sequester it, and that would alleviate the greenhouse gas problems largely. However, this is pretty expensive, and this is pretty uncommon. So actually, it sounds good in paper, but it's not actually in practice in reality so far. Now, Eastman Chemical in the United States, in Tennessee, actually has a plant, 1,250 tons per day of coal. They put in a big gasifier, and they run it, and make the water gas shift reaction, and then they make this nice syngas, and then they convert the syngas to chemicals. And they very, very beautiful plant. And they sell the chemicals. And it works for Eastman Chemical because they're selling the stuff as chemicals, not as fuel. So if you had to sell it at world fuel prices, they would be losing money. But because they're selling it as specialty chemicals, then you can charge a much higher margin. So this actually works out for them. And this is a nice example. If you ever want to see one, you can go down and take a tour of the plant. We can show how these things actually work. This is very well-established technology. It's commercial. You can also do a different technology called coal liquefaction, direct coal liquefaction, where you don't react in a gasifier first. Instead, you directly go from the solid to a liquid by reacting with hydrogen. And a plant for this was built by China in Inner Mongolia. And this is a picture of the site where they built the plant 10 years ago. And this is the site 6 years later. And it shows that if you're really determined, you can build big stuff pretty fast in the middle of nowhere. And so they built this huge direct coal liquefaction plant. I believe it's the biggest one ever built in the world. And I guess we'll find out in a few years whether this was a good economic decision or not, or whether or not this company is still in business, or how much subsidy they're taking from the Chinese government. But again, this makes sense from an energy security point of view for sure, because they have plenty of coal in Inner Mongolia. But they don't have much use for it. But if they can make it liquid fuels are very expensive. They make a lot of money. And also, they import the liquid fuels primarily, so this reduces the need to import so much liquid fuel. I think they do water gas shift on coal, so they make a ton of CO2 emissions. So from a greenhouse gas point of view, I think this is probably not very good. But I haven't seen the exact balance, but I would guess. Yeah, actually a sad thing about this Eastman one, they had this beautiful plant, and they end up with this beautiful pure CO2 stream. Because they separate everything beautifully. They have great separations because they're trying to make pure chemicals. Very nice. And they have this great pipe that's full of CO2, and then they just open up the atmosphere, and they just shoot it out. Because right now, there's no cost to dumping it in the atmosphere. Nobody wants the CO2, and so they just dump it. That would be a perfect stream where if you had a carbon sequestration, that would be perfect. You have the CO2 stream, it's just pouring out. You could have it goes already pure and clean and lovely. And so you could just take a pipe under the ground and bury it in the ground. It might be an interesting project, but somebody would have to pay for it. And certainly the Eastman Chemical shareholders don't want to pay for it. And probably the Eastman Chemical's customers don't want to pay more for the chemicals in order to allow them to do that either, I guess. All right, so coal to liquids. There's a very well-established technology for coal to liquids via syngas. There's some technology for coal liquefaction, as I showed in the Chinese plant. And it appears to be sort of competitive technologically with the other route. I don't know which one of these is really better, but it's definitely not as well developed, so I really don't know. Using coal to make your transportation fuel is definitely good for energy security. And there's a lot of coal left, more than coal than oil, so it's good for supply. But the economics are not that great. Even though the coal is very cheap, the capital investment is very huge for these plants. And also the CO2 emissions are worse than oil, considerably worse. Now, you could ameliorate that if you captured the CO2. So here's an example. You suppose this is not for coal to liquids, but just for, say, a burning coal. If you take a regular power plant, oops. Out of batteries. Okay. You'll have to imagine my hands. All right. So you take a regular power plant, you get about 35% efficiency converting the coal into electricity. If you want to capture the CO2, the efficiency drops to about 25%. And so you lose a very significant amount of your output by the CO2 capture. And it's quite the same for the coal to liquids plants as well. And particularly if you, in a chemicals plant, maybe not so much because you already have a clean separation. But if you're not making chemicals but just a fuel, you might actually have more separations cost as well. So it's definitely possible to do it, but you're sacrificing maybe a third of your output if you go to if you capture the CO2. All right. Option number 8, last one. You guys are very patient. All right, fuels from biomass. So I told you that fuels from food is not such a great idea, but we have a lot more biomass than fuel. So for example, you have a corn plant, you have the corn cob, it has some grains that has the starch in it. That's only a very small fraction of the weight of the plant. And a lot of the rest of the plant is what's called corn stover, and that's a lot of material. So if you just go by mass point of view, there's a lot more biomass than there is food. And waste biomass in the world is now approximately enough to replace about 20% of the liquid fuel consumption in the world. So there is it's a material amount. It's not enough to replace all the liquid fuel, but it's a significant amount. It would be good for energy security since almost every country that has a high population also has a lot of arable land and a lot of biomass because people tend to live where the arable land is. It would also be good for climate because you would be, right now the waste biomass degrades in the ground and most of it's converted by microorganisms back into CO2 anyway. So it's just like it's going to go to CO2 anyway, you might as well just use it to drive your car around as well. There's also options that you could try to make explicit energy crops, like algae, for example, on some wasteland. And so maybe you could actually increase this number a little bit. As I'll talk in the last part of this talk, there's a lot of different possible ways to convert biomass to different fuels. But basically, none of these are commercial. And it's a very heavy R&D topic right now. And my personal opinion is that whatever we do is not going to be cheap. So you can do this. You might be able to make it economical, but you're not going to make a lot of money if you're selling it at the oil price. And so there's a challenge for us all to figure out how you could possibly make this really work. So there's lots and lots of different routes being studied, both biological and thermochemical. And the best routes right now convert about 40% of the carbon atoms in the biomass into useful liquid fuel. If you had some external source of hydrogen, for example, natural gas, you can make a little bit more. Biomass is hard to collect and transport. So it grows everywhere, so there's not much of it anywhere. It's all very spread out. And so you have to collect this waste biomass. You can't collect all the biomass because you'll kill the field. You have to make sure some of the nutrients get back from the waste biomass into the soil. So there's some tricky thing about how to collect it just right. And then it's low energy density, so it's a pain to transport it from wherever you collect it to some central facility. It's possible to increase the energy density, for example, by torrefaction, which is making a kind of charcoal out of it. But this is very early days in the R&D, and exactly how to handle this is not clear. And just the emphasis is biomass is not free. I mean, it's waste, so the material's free, but it's free if you can go to that field and get it and take it back, right? But your time costs something to go get it. So it's definitely not free. And really, you can only work this in locations that have a lot of waste biomass that's not being used for any high-value purpose, or if you happen to have a lot of excess arable land. Now, most countries in the world don't have a lot of excess arable land, so this is not an option for most of them. But some countries do, like, for example, Brazil has arable land. Maybe the United States. And this turns out to have a lot of niche opportunities because of the same as natural gas. So natural gas is hard to transport. Biomass is hard to transport too. And so because of that, it gets to be very local. You can have a local area that has a huge amount of biomass. It might be economical to make a plant there, but then some other place it's not going to be economical. And it all depends on what kind of biomass it is. Different plants process differently and so on. And so that's makes it very interesting as an R&D challenge because there's a lot of opportunities. Yeah?
I think the current infrastructure for handling food that goes a lot of transportation as well.
Yeah.
I think the transport requirement for biomass is significantly higher than that for food.
I think the transport requirement for biomass is higher than for food, but maybe the same order of magnitude. I think for sure places where you grow a lot of food also tend to have a lot of waste biomass. And you also have a lot of farmers who know how to handle stuff like this. And usually they're successful farmers because they're in a place that grows a lot of stuff. So they have more education, are more running it as a business, run their farming as a business. So if you go to, for example, Iowa, the farmers there are perfectly capable to capture all the corn stalks and to leave the right amount in the soil and to take them back and to get them shipped and to form co-ops and borrow money and build plants, and they can do the whole thing. Okay? Other places in the world, they have agriculture, but there's no way. They don't have enough biomass, they don't have the infrastructure, and they wouldn't go. So the places that are really wealthy, northwestern India, right? There's a very rich area, grows a lot of stuff. Those farmers are probably very capable. I think other areas in India probably not. So it's a very local thing. In the United States, the same in the southern United States, has a lot of farmers, but it's not the land is not that productive. So actually, I doubt that those farms could really make this work. But there might be some places. Louisiana has some niches, some spots where it's really fertile and might be really good. So it's very much a niche thing. And you have to look down to the scale of sort of the 10-kilometer scale to see which areas might be a good opportunity for biomass. Another issue about this is seasonality. So at least in the temperate zones, you only get one crop a year. And so the problem is utilization of capital. So you have some equipment that's good for harvesting biomass and converting it to a liquid fuel. If you're only going to use it for 1 month a year, then it makes your capital cost much higher. So trying to figure out how to handle that, I think that's not resolved of how to handle that problem. All right, a quiz. All right, I told you 8 alternatives here. And I want you to tell me which of these 8 alternatives you think are actually worth pursuing. All right? And then pick your favorite one and write down what are the weak points with your favorite alternative. And this is very important because this tells you where the R&D opportunity is. Or if it's not R&D, suppose it's a political weak point or economic weak point, then it tells you what you need to do to organize or to find investors, or whatever you need to do to solve the problem. So let's take a few minutes to do that. And for those of you who don't have the papers in front of you, I'll flash through what the options are. Oops. Option 1 was improving efficiency. Option 2 was batteries. Option 3 was compressed natural gas. Option 4 was tar. Option 5 was biofuels from food. Option 6 is liquids from natural gas, liquid fuel from natural gas, called GTL. Option 7 was CTL, coal to liquids. And option 8 is fuels and biomass. Yeah. Sorry, so say again. Yeah, so the question is about whether or not biomass is really carbon neutral. I gave the simplistic argument that the carbon in the biomass came from CO2 in the air, so therefore, and it's going to go back there anyway, so you might as well just burn it or use it for your fuel. The situation is actually more complicated, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this talk. In fact, we usually use some fossil fuels to help our agriculture out, and so that we generate extra CO2 emissions for everything we grow. Yeah, there's actually quite tricky, complicated questions about that. Another question? Yes? On this one? No, this is up to you. No. I'm trying to get you to sharpen your own thinking about what do you think. It depends on the country? It could be. Yeah. It's definitely possible. Some of these, like the biomass, is very, very local. Maybe compressed natural gas also is very local. Pick your favorite country. My goal here is that I'm hoping that many of you in your lives are going to help solve this problem. Because we have a big problem. And the first step to be able to solve a problem is to articulate for yourself what's the problem. And what do you think is worthwhile to invest your time in to try to solve it. So at least I'm trying to sharpen your thinking about this. Yeah?
So if we somehow manage to get the safety problem,
okay, so this is a proposal for option number 9, which is to switch to hydrogen as a fuel. Certainly some people are working on that pretty hard. The US government's investing a lot. Yeah. Lightning bolts. I've never heard of that, but it sounds good. Okay, so another possibility is to try to harvest the energy of lightning bolts. All right. We got option number 10. All right. Do you have anybody who's willing to tell us an answer from their thing? Option 3. Why option 3?
Why is it good?
Yeah. Well, actually, tell them what is option 3. Remind everybody. What is it? Compressed natural gas?
Yeah.
Okay. Why is it good?
Why is that?
Sorry, what?
Why is that or is it good?
Yeah. Why is bad?
Why is that? Okay. I've been down infrastructure, problems storing the car, safety, range, long-term price stability, natural gas. I saw some stats that it might fluctuate a lot.
Okay, so you guys all heard that. So So this gentleman is voting for option number 3, combustion natural gas, but he notices that we don't have the infrastructure. There might be some safety issues with the storage and the cylinders. And there's also, it's not clear if the economics really going to work out in the long term. The economics are good right now, but who knows? Because the price of natural gas is almost as fluctuates, maybe even more than oil, about the same as oil, which is quite a lot, like crazy.
But it's better than making it into liquid because then you'll have to always keep on putting fuel to keep making it into liquid, as opposed to first you create the infrastructure and then go again to.
Okay, so this gentleman argues that it's better to do CNG instead of gas to liquids because the operating cost is less, or?
Because you have to always keep converting into liquid, so you always have to come on the other fuel.
Okay, so for preservation of the natural gas supply, CNG is more efficient than gas to liquids, so therefore you'll have more supply for longer. This is more sustainable supply that way than GTO. Okay, I buy that.
On GTO, question. You were talking about how the reactive methane was a problem.
Yeah.
Is that a problem to be solved by smart engineering or technology?
Okay, so the question is for gas to liquids, methane, I said, is very difficult to react, or at least it's hard to react and make it stop reacting. The intermediates are more reactive than the starting material. That's a fundamental problem. However, I think that some really smart chemists and engineers might be able to beat this problem. It's possible. However, a lot of people worked on this for a long time and they haven't done it yet. So you can make your own conclusions about whether you think that's likely to be beat. There's probably 100 journal papers every year about people having different ideas about how to do this. But you don't see anybody doing it. So obviously there's still room for improvement. Yes?
Option 1.
Option 1, improve efficiency.
Yeah.
What's the weak point?
Weak point would be slow investments right now.
Okay, so the weak point is it takes a lot of capital.
Yeah.
Well, there's only 1% interest rates right now, right?
But still, it doesn't make sense right now to improve the efficiency at such high cost. Like, even though there are better engines, people don't use that because they're costlier.
Okay, so this is a good point. So I mean, the interest rates officially are low, right? They're 1%. I could borrow money for my house at 4% or something. It's amazing. But actually, if you try to borrow money to buy a high-efficiency car, I think that, or to build a factory to make high-efficiency cars, I think you might have trouble to find a banker who's willing to lend you the money. So I think you're right, that capital is not really as freely available as you might think. And that's a huge problem with improving efficiency. And it's a problem, a lot of efficiency improvements are paid for out of little budgets. You know, for example, when my town wants to buy a new pickup truck for fixing the roads, they could buy, 2 different engines, say a gasoline engine or a diesel engine, and they might buy the gasoline engine vehicle because it's a little bit cheaper, because my town budget's tight, even though in the long term it might not make any sense. But from the decision-making sociology of the person making the decision at that time, in his budget this year, he has enough money to buy the gasoline-powered pickup truck and not the diesel truck. And he doesn't pay the long-term problem. He'll probably be retired before this truck is retired. And so he's not going to be paying the diesel bills, the fuel bills, in later years. And this is a general sociological problem everywhere. And many people in general would rather defer cost to the future, hoping that somehow they'll get out of it. And so they're reluctant to make the upfront investments.
Our technology cycle is still in the olden days where we are still thinking of improving, slight improvements rather than new technology. So that's where.
Okay, so that's a problem, challenge for this audience. That the efficiency improvements that people usually talk about in the vehicle field are relatively small improvements most of the time. And so that makes it not exciting. It makes the person who's making the investment says, why should I bother to make this investment? I'm only going to get 3% improvement. And it just, it's kind of discouraging the whole field. Now, you are the bright engineers of the future. If you guys figure it out and say you get an improvement that gives you a factor of 2 in one fell swoop, then maybe you could go to some venture capitalist and give you a lot of money to start a new car company and makes cars that are twice as efficient as everybody else's cars. But you got to be pretty good to do that. Yeah?
I was going to say 8. So I think one thing that, obviously that's what I think is good, but one thing that they're very close to that I think is interesting is artificial photosynthesis. And I think that in the next 5 to 8 years, you're going to see a huge boom in the change in the industry. So it's going to go from R&D is going to be like sort of like R&D, like research and brains. And so you have this huge, I mean, even MIT is very close to artificial photosynthesis.
Let me just repeat so that everybody else can hear. So the here I'm only talking about fuels from biomass, which assumes you have a plant. But there's another whole idea is to try to like make a synthetic plant that just artificially does reactions similar to photosynthesis, takes solar energy and makes, say, some chemical bonds, and makes a liquid fuel that way. And some researchers at MIT and some people in the US government who've given out money think this is a really great idea, and they have a lot of ideas of what to do, and there's been a lot of breakthroughs in that field. I would say right now it's really far from deployable at an 80 million barrels per day scale, but
I think you
but
said
it's
like this is the highest yield to get a liquid fuel, and it's renewable. So it's good for the environment. It's the highest yield to get a liquid fuel, so you can replace electricity with not even an artificial plant, which is with controlling like electron transfer, which they're much closer to than an artificial plant. You might solve a bigger chunk of the electricity problem, and now you only need, you can't fly an airplane on an extension cord, right? But you do a lot of other stuff with electricity, so you won't need as much liquid fuel.
okay. So that's a slightly different one. So another one is that you could just say, well, let's displace the problem. So for example, if you could figure out some really great way to make electricity, then all the fossil fuels we use to make electricity right now, you might be able to redirect them to make something else, which eventually can make liquid fuels. And that's another whole option. So for example, suppose there's a great breakthrough in photovoltaics. And so we were able to put photovoltaics everywhere. Everybody had electricity. It was free. So cheap they didn't have to meter it. They had lots of electricity. Then all of a sudden, all the natural gas that's being now burned to make electricity could be redirected, for example, to make CNG for trucks or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that could work out. Mr. Wrights.
I just wanted to say, referring to option number 1 again, that the government is afraid because they have mandated CFA standards, fuel economy projects.
That's right.
And so capital investment has to follow.
That's right. So yeah, I hope you all know that the United States has raised its fuel economy standards quite a lot, and I believe some other countries have raised them pretty much too. And so what that's happening, what that's doing is saying, we don't care that the capital investment doesn't really make economic sense. We require you to make this capital investment. You can't sell the cars unless they reach a certain minimum fuel economy standard. And so that's a way to force the market to make a higher investment in efficiency than the people might naturally have done if they were just judging on their own nickel. And so that's really great for bringing the new technology in. And then the government's made that decision because the government's also paying for the health and pollution impacts. They're paying balance of payment problems. They're paying for the security. And they're thinking, well, maybe overall for us, from the point of view of the society, it makes more sense to make the investment in the capital investment to improve the vehicles. So therefore, we won't have to spend on all these other things we're spending on. Which I think is a very legitimate argument. Yes?
More of a question. Thank you very much for the overall presentation. So I'm just wondering, as a combustion researcher, what do you advise to be our position when we advise policymakers all the time which direction to take? You may be working with biomass or biofuel combustion, but there is an interest for you to sell that idea that this is the best way forward. But for the society, it may actually be.
Yeah, so my opinion. First of all, I should tell you, I'm a total failure at this. So the congressional staff came to MIT, and they asked us to run a little mini course for them about energy. And I told them all this kind of stuff I'm showing you now. And they were crushed. They were so disappointed. They thought it was the worst talk they ever heard. And I was like, well, what's wrong? And they said, all I wanted you to do was to stand up here and tell your congressman to vote for this, and you solved the energy problem. They didn't want any complicated story. They didn't want any alternatives. They didn't want options. They didn't want to have the weak points of each option. They didn't want to hear any of that. They wanted, this is the gold-plated, guaranteed. If you make this one vote, you've solved the world's problem. You can tell your voters you've solved all the problems. So I told them the truth, and they didn't want to hear it. And so anyway, I really don't know what the advice is. I think, though, as to the engineers, and particularly the academic engineers, have a responsibility to the society to try to be straight and to try to lay out the real choices and try to educate people about what the real choices are, because, especially the political leaders, about the real choices. There's a lot of people who go to the political leaders only when they want a subsidy for their technology that they like or they have an investment in. And I think that's really corrosive of public trust in the engineers and scientists. I think we really have to work our best to try to fairly lay it out and try to do it maybe a little more loudly so that people realize like this is like a pressing problem that needs some attention, and that there really is some decisions to be made. I think that most of the people in the government, and certainly people at large, would rather the engineers just decide it for them and just solve all the problems, and they don't need to worry about it. But if we want to do that, we've got to get our act together among the engineers a little bit better than we have so far. All right, let me go on with a few more slides, and then we'll take a break. All right, so let's do quickly. What do we want in new fuel? So I'm going to presume that you guys have bought that we should stop using oil. I would say, actually, myself, I'm not 100% convinced. But it's perfectly plausible that it would be a good idea to stop using oil, or to use less of it. So suppose we're going to try to make a new fuel. What would we have to do? And there's a lot of constraints on the fuel. So let's talk about that. So what do we want? We're making a fuel. We might as well make it a liquid. We decide liquids are better. There's only certain elements we can put in this fuel. Most seriously, because we can't afford to put in elements that are going to make some polluting product as the exhaust. The fuel can't be corrosive because we have to be able to carry it around in tanks safely. It has to have enough volatility that we can ignite it, and maybe not too much volatility so it'll be evaporating away or causing a safety hazard. The ignition delay of the fuel has to match what the engine requires. The flame speed has to be fast enough for the engine. And fundamentally, it's got to be really cheap, because you're competing with oil, which is a liquid. They just put a hole in the ground and it comes out, right? It's hard to beat that price. And so you really have to figure out what you can do to be really cheap. And you need to be very plentiful. We're using 80 million barrels per day of fuel, just a vast amount of fuel. And so if you want to compete with that, or even on the same scale as that, you need to be millions of barrels per day to start with, to be of any interest, even to be a few percent of the problem. Also, there's a lot of other requirements. So there's certain solubility and phase behavior requirements for fuels. You have to be consistent from batch to batch, because the engine manufacturers are counting on the fuel to be the same every day. The environmental impacts, there's a lot of environmental impacts associated with fuel. You have to really watch out about all of them. There's a lot of safety issues. Fuel is an energy container, and that energy can blow up and kill people. And that's a really serious thing you have to worry about. It has to be stable in storage. So the fuel may sit around for many months between the time you make it and when it's being used. And hopefully it'll be the same stuff a few months later. And also the viscosity has to be right to match the fuel injection system. So I want to thank Tim Wallington. He gave me a few of these slides, which I'll show, and then we'll take a break right after that. So what do we want the fuel? Well, so Tim Wallington argues it this way. He says, we'd really rather just carry around the least amount of weight that we can manage. So we can carry around one reactant of an exothermic reaction and then get the other one from the environment everywhere we are. Well, what's everywhere we are is the air. So and what's in the air that can react? The only thing is oxygen. So we want to find something that reacts with oxygen. And we want some really exothermic reaction between our fuel and the oxygen. And then the fuel's got to be super abundant, or really easy to make and really cheap, because we need to make millions of tons of it every day. And the fuel should be environmentally benign and renewable, because if you're making millions of tons of something every day, you're going to spill some of it. And you really don't want that to be a disaster every time you spill a little bit of this fuel. We would prefer to dump the products of the reaction rather than carrying them back with us, because of weight considerations. So therefore, the exhaust should be environmentally benign. And even if we carry it, we want it to be benign, because we carry around millions of tons of this waste material. And so we want that to be benign also. And we really want the fuel and the exhaust to both be liquids or gases, so we don't have to handle any solids. So we look at the periodic table. There's all the elements. We look at the density. You can calculate out pretty quickly that you need a couple of gigajoules of energy to carry on your vehicle for a car. And we figure it gets to be impractical to carry more than about 100 kilograms worth of your reactant, of your fuel. So therefore, you need something that can release more than 10 kilojoules per gram when it reacts with oxygen. And then you can say, well, I could try to make this with highly endothermic compounds. But endothermic compounds are dangerous because they can spontaneously decompose back to the elements. And so, in general, they're mostly not that stable. So probably you actually want something that's no more stable, no more reactive, no more energetically uphill than the actual elements. We'll just consider the elements, and we figure that that'll set an upper bound. Well, if you consider the elements that have enthalpies of oxidation greater than 10 kilojoules per gram, it's only those ones there. Okay? And we require that the oxide that you make as a product not be a solid. It's only these ones here. And if you do the intersection, it's only these two elements. So there's your choices of the elements you can use. So hydrogen can work. That's one of them is a possibility. Carbon, hydrogen are fine. And that's about it. Now let's talk a little bit about oxygen and nitrogen. So in our combustion chamber, we're going to have oxygen and nitrogen because we're going to use air. So they're going to be there. They're not desirable from an energy density point of view because they don't add any energy density to our fuel. But actually, it turns out having a little bit of oxygen is actually helpful. It helps to make the combustion go a little bit better, makes a little bit less soot. If you have nitrogen in your fuel, it tends to make some NOx, which is undesirable, but it also tends to be good for, have some surfactancy, which is good for cleaning fuel injectors. So maybe we can tolerate a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of nitrogen. And the hydrogen bonding in the liquid fuels with oxygen and nitrogen actually helps with evaporative cooling. It has sort of a second order effect that it makes the octane number of the fuel go up. And it also does charge cooling, so you actually get a little bit more air in the cylinder. So your power density is slightly higher. So overall, a little bit of oxygen, a little bit of nitrogen in our fuel is not bad. Obviously, it's mostly got to be carbon and hydrogen. And we just noticed that biomass actually has a lot of oxygen in it already and some nitrogen. So maybe it's not necessary to get them all out. That's my conclusion from that. All right. So hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, and I'd say a little bit of nitrogen might be okay too. And that's basically what we've got. And it's got to be a liquid fuel. Really, you'd like it to be a liquid even down to -20, so it won't freeze in Minnesota in the winter, or Wisconsin in the winter. It's a very serious safety issue in aircraft because they always fly at high altitude where the temperature is low. You want the energy density per volumetric to be high enough, say better than CNG. That makes hydrogen kind of tough. It's not really quite high enough, but it's maybe marginally high enough energy density. All right. If you want it to, again, you don't want it to be corrosive. Of course, corrosive depends on what the materials are, so it's sort of a confusing word to use. Really, what you want is backwards compatible. So you want your new fuel to work in an old vehicle, which means it has to be compatible with all the materials they used in the old vehicle. This is a very challenging problem, actually. And you want the volatility to be right, so that it evaporates to a flammable gas. And there's some molecules, in particular sugars, which are the main components of biomass, which pyrolyze to solids before they evaporate. So those are no good as transportation fuels. The ignition delay has to be right. So if you take fuel and air and you mix it, it spontaneously ignites after some delay. And it's very sensitive to the fuel structure. The details of this is very complicated. It's also sensitive, of course, to the temperature and pressure. And we measure this with things like octane number or cetane number. And the different engines require very different delays. And so for new engines, sometimes it's not so clear what you want exactly. And so, for example, I think Professor Wright's engine wants two different fuels with very different ignition delays. So sometimes you want a long one, sometimes you want a short one. In any case, you have to know this. And you might not want to make a mixture that contains both long delay and short delay fuels because then it'll have like a mediocre delay that's no good for anything. So that's a practical problem. This is showing when we change the temperature a little bit. This is experimental decay has actually been written by Brian, who's in the audience. And when you change the fuel, the stoichiometry by factors of 2, or you change the temperature by 10%, you see you get orders of magnitude different ignition delays. So the ignition delay is very, very sensitive parameter. And also, if you change the chemical structure a little bit, you get very huge changes too. This plot is from my lab. It shows we don't know how to predict ignition delays. So we're working on that. That's a big part of the CEFRC, is trying to be able to predict things like this. And you get small changes. So for example, from normal butanol to isobutanol, you change 12 units in the octane scale. It's pretty amazing. You need a high enough flame speed. But fortunately, most fuels actually have very similar flame speeds. So this is not usually a big deal. But hydrogen and acetylene are unusual in that regard. This is very important near the lean limit. The flame could blow out, high-speed flows, some kinds of jet engines, for example. And it's helpful in spark-ignited engines. And finally, it's got to be cheap and plentiful. I'm going to keep emphasizing this. You're going to be competing with petroleum, which is just stuff that's in the ground. You just dig it out of the ground, and in fact, it's a liquid, it just flows out of the ground. And you can't really count on a subsidy favoring your fuel forever. And so you really, if you want to make a new fuel, you have to think of something that has a chance to be plentiful enough and economical enough that people will buy it. And it takes a lot of capital to verify you've got a good fuel and to manufacture it. And no one's going to invest in this capital unless it looks like it's going to be economically viable for a long time. And it's going to be available in a large volume, like millions of barrels. And so that really restricts. There aren't that many things available in millions of barrel scale. So that really restricts your choices. All right, and I think I'll stop here and I'll talk about these other properties of fuels after the break. So let's